Buddy, it's me again. It's Ryan. This new episode of The Big Draw, we have the wonderful. How do I want to make sure I say your last name right, Thomas? Do you want to say it for me?
It's Umstattd.
Umstattd. I keep wanting to say Hothstat, but it's because I've been watching Mad Men. Um, I'm a big fan of this man's channel. He's got the longest running novel marketing podcast in history, and I listen to his stuff a lot while working on my own, literary endeavors. And I just think he's brilliant, and I think he's got a great head on his shoulders, and I'm glad to have him on. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to address my audience with anything particular? Do you want to tell them more about yourself before we get into Solomon Kane, which is the thing I can't wait to talk about?
Yeah. So I host three podcasts: Novel Marketing, which Ryan mentioned, which is about getting more readers for your book. I host Christian Publishing Show, which is focused around craft and the publishing process. And then we have a brand new YouTube show that's currently on the Novel Marketing YouTube channel called Author Update, which focuses on news, publishing news, marketing news, and also generalized news and how it applies to authors.
It's excellent. It's wonderful. So where he and I actually started a conversation at the beginning of this where we were starting to get into it, but I wanted to save a lot of it for the cast itself. And so you were talking about Solomon Kane, and I would love to know what your thoughts are about that, because I think it had come up because you were kind enough to compare some of the work that I do to like some of Robert E. Howard's efforts with Solomon Kane.
Yeah, so Conan is, of course, the more famous of the Robert E.
Yeah.
Howard stories.
Yes.
And Conan is a figure that is kind of against civilization. So the typical Conan story,
Yeah.
civilization is evil and corrupt. The kings are corrupt and the wizards are corrupt. And Conan is not a good man. But at least he has a code of honor. And it's his code of honor that kind of insulates him from the corruption of the society around him while he's smashing bad guys and killing demons and saving damsels, etc. And when Robert Howard stopped writing Conan, he shifted mostly to this other character, Solomon Kane, who, yeah, these stories take place, I think, in the 1600s. So he's like a Puritan. He's like a warrior Puritan. So, like, imagine a violent Presbyterian who wears this big black Puritan hat and goes around fighting zombies and killing evil. And he's a very righteous man. And one of the interesting things about it is there's a lot of Deus Ex Machina, because he's not very spiritual. You don't see him like praying a lot, but you do see kind of like he's seemingly very lucky. And you're like, oh wait, this is, his God is looking after him as he's fighting these monsters.
Yeah.
And Black Marrow seemed like a very similar type of character in that he's fighting evil. He's kind of rough around the edges, but he's not advancing good. He's destroying evil, which is really fun for a protagonist, I think.
Yeah, I love that comparison. I mean, I actually, you asked if I'd known about Solomon Kane. I feel like I bring him up like once a month on my YouTube channel. It's like I'm like a grandpa who just starts sundowning, and then I talk about I talk about Solomon Kane. I talk about my time as a boxing coach. I talk about like 5 or 6 key things, but something that might shock you, based because anyone reading Black Mirror would think, oh, this guy clearly like loves Robert E. Howard. But I actually didn't start reading Robert E. Howard until about a year ago. And then I got really into it. And then I actually had done Black Mirror book 1 before I even really knew much about Solomon Kane, which is really funny because I just, after reading it, I was like, wow, this is so my taste. And it's interesting what you say about him. So points of confusion for me is I thought that Solomon Kane was actually the first one that he had created. I thought that Conan the Barbarian was actually after the fact, but I could be wrong.
I could be wrong on this. I'll check, but I believe Solomon Kane came second because it's not coming out of copyright anytime soon.
Oh, really?
Whereas Conan is actually coming out of the first Conan stories will be exiting copyright in just a few years, which means anyone can write a Conan story now and be able to publish it just about the time it's finished. Whereas I think Solomon Kane is going to be a little bit later.
Yeah, I'm personally so much more interested in if I had to pick one of those that I'd want to work on, Solomon Kane would absolutely be I think he's a far more interesting character personally.
Yeah, and he's an archetype. So the fact that you found your way to this character on your own before you discovered him is very kind of quintessential of archetypal characters. That's the other thing about Conan,
Mm,
who's very much an archetype, and Arthur actually is an archetype. So
yeah.
I have some thoughts for. We can keep talking about Cain, but I have a lot of thoughts for your Arthur book if you want to talk about
Oh,
that.
I would anything you want to talk about. I keep I keep the format of the show pretty loose. So it's you guide the conversation. I'm here to enjoy your company.
So the Arthur stories are very archetypal, and they are very much inspired by the biblical story of King David and his mighty men. So you have Samuel, the wizard with the staff and the robe, doing magic and advising the king. You have King David fighting giants. You have Arthur fighting giants. Right? You have David coming from humble backgrounds. You have Arthur coming from humble backgrounds. You have
Sure.
David's mighty men doing great feats of strength and valor. You have David being betrayed and Arthur being betrayed. Like the stories very much rhyme. And if you look at the story of David and kind of where it fits in the long story of the Old Testament. What's fun about the Old Testament is that you get to follow a single people group through basically every epoch of civilization. So you start off with like a guy who has a kid, and then they have a family, and then they grow to a tribe, and then that tribe goes through this awkward adolescence and eventually becomes a kingdom, and then it becomes a great kingdom, and then it falls into corruption and decline, and then eventually the kingdom collapses and the people is reborn with a new kingdom. And to like tell that story, you have to take 1500 years because these are all different ages, right? There's seasons where the story is very much a Western story,
Yeah.
where David is very much like a sheriff in the Wild West, right? Trying to bring civilization and fighting off the Philistines. Very much like Arthur fighting the Saxons and trying to establish a government and using government for a force of good, right? So
Mm.
all you need is a tumbleweed
Yeah.
blowing between Goliath and David, right? It's the same kind of showdown, as opposed to, say, a dystopian story where the government is evil and corrupt and the seemingly powerless protagonist has to stand up against the evil and corrupt government, which you still get in the Old Testament. You just get that with Elijah, right? Elijah
Yeah.
is facing King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And I feel like all stories you can kind of fit on this continuum where you have a pure Western on one end of the continuum and a pure dystopian on the other, where it's all a question of like, is the government good? Can you use the power of government to do good, or is the power of government being used to do evil? And what's interesting about Arthur is that he's not just a warrior, he's also a king. And
Yeah.
so an Arthur story reads as much like a political thriller as he's trying to create a government that can survive in this world of giants and wizards and invading tribes from the north and all of the other challenges that he's facing.
Yeah. And that's so that's an angle that I'm actually really interested in is the conflict between how would I put it? I'd say the conflict between what makes for a great leader and what makes for a hero, because they don't always align. You know, it's like, especially with the ideals of a medieval king, it's like you put your people first versus the hero that puts like, I would say in their hierarchy of like objective morality, as in morality through the eyes of God. You know, like as far as the priority of what is the highest ordered good sometimes conflicts with what a king would need to do in order to manage his kingdom. So that conflict in a character is something I'm really interested in. And I want to also touch upon something you said, which I find really fascinating, which is you just did something that I feel like I've often remarked on, which is that the American Western is very closely related. It's like a distant cousin or like a grandchild to the European fantasy, in that they both seem to tap into similar things. And there's a few layers to that, because some of it is, you know, what you just described, right? Which is the discussion of the morality of anarchy versus the morality of order. But also, I suspect that Americans, you know, or people who love Westerns, kind of their experience of Westerns is not dissimilar to the experience of someone reading fantasy, which is the there's certain freedom. There's a fantasy of freedom that you get when you go further into the past. Um, yeah, go ahead. I can feel you wanting to say something. Go for it.
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful for us to explain what we mean by Western, because
Yes.
there's two kinds of Western. There's the aesthetic genre, which is the cowboy hats and the boots and the pistols and the kind of dusty environment. And that aesthetic genre you can put on exactly the opposite kind of story that we're talking about. So that's Cowboy Bebop. That's Firefly, right? Firefly is a very dystopian world. They're not trying to create civilization, but they are wearing cowboy hats. So what we're talking about is the kind of narrative Western where the sheriff is trying to bring law and order to a lawless world. And because the world is so lawless, he has to be a warrior. He can't just be a politician. He has to be willing to pull out his six shooter and shoot the bad guy, right? And kind of
Yeah.
take the law into his own hands, so to speak. And I just watched Tombstone this week with a group of friends, and there's a great line in that film where one of the cowboys defects from this criminal gang called the Cowboys, and he says there has to be some laws.
Yeah.
It was like, that's it. That's the core of the Western, right? Are we going to be men of laws, or are we going to be a world of just the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must?
Yeah, and an interesting, the character you're talking about is someone who is kind of a sycophant. Like he's not even really a member of the cowboy gang. He's just someone who idolized them. So you're kind of watching him realize like he's been idolizing the wrong people to some extent, which I think is an interesting turn for his character. That's one of the best movies ever made. I think Tombstone is tremendous. It's like you can find almost anything you want in that film.
I feel bad it took me this long to watch it.
Oh, really?
But I very much, yeah, this is the first time for me to see it. I was like, wow, Westerns can be good.
Yeah, you were not a Western guy for most of your life, I would wager.
I hadn't watched many. I grew up watching like The Alamo with John Wayne, but I don't feel like that's like a true Western because it's really more it's more of a historical, like military story
Yeah, war
with
film.
the aesthetics, right? Again, so it was Western in its aesthetics, but in a sense it was Western in the sense that they're trying to build a civilization, but the what's interesting about that story is that it's very much a conversation about civilization.
Mm,
And because the Mexican troops are shown to be very honorable, right? They're following kind of the Western norms of honorable and just war, right? They're showing the mercy to the women and the white flag of truce and the negotiations and all of that. And it's very much a conversation about republics and civilization. And so it's not a clash of civilizations, but it is a clash of governments. So the Mexican government was a very different kind of government, even though it was inside of the same civilization.
yeah. And I mean, I remember that movie, and it seems to really stress the idea that if not for the government conflict, these two groups of men would probably be friends. They,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they were. That's the thing.
yeah.
Like Stephen F. Austin in the historical story was actually in Mexico in the process of negotiating for Texas to become a state of Mexico. So right at the time we were a Mexican territory and we wanted to become a full state of Mexico with all of the rights and responsibilities there too. And then they came for our guns and we are like, well, I guess we're not joining you anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Bit of a point of contention historically.
like, like this is a deal breaker for the Texans beyond what people outside of Texas realize.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. Yeah, I see. I saw that movie a long time ago, and I remember thinking about it a little while back because I was like, man, if I watch this, this was before I really had done my deep dive into history that has sort of defined a lot of my 30s. I bet if I watched it again, I would have a whole new appreciation for it.
There is a beautiful speech that the Davy Crockett John Wayne character gives about republic. And it's like, I love the sound of that word. And it's like, oh, he's not saying democracy. You can tell this is an older story. Because a lot of people think the United States is democracy. But we don't pledge allegiance to the democracy for which it stands.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And so the older stuff goes back to our true form of government. But yeah, some people in the chat are suggesting westerns. Give me the list. I'm going to start watching
Okay.
westerns. So
Well,
yeah, give me only good ones though. None of this mediocre western stuff.
so
Tombstone are equivalent in quality.
Gigi just asked if you've seen Lonesome Dove, which she and I are pretty good friends, and we haven't discussed Lonesome Dove, which is funny because that's maybe my favorite movie of all time. It's actually a miniseries. It was with, I mean, look at this cast: Robert Duvall, Tommy Lee Jones, um, a young, oh my God, not Diane Keaton, Diane Lane, a young Diane Lane. Um, the cast, I mean, there's like, oh, Danny Glover. It's incredible. It's an ensemble cast. It's like a 6 hour miniseries altogether, and it's like I wouldn't call it a series of vignettes. It's an epic tome about different people's lives in the West, and it's one of the great. I mean, it's a great novel too. The novel is one of my favorite books ever, but the series is a masterpiece. And Robert Duvall actually says the character he plays in that is his, still to this day, the favorite character he's ever played. Um, it's really amazing. It's about two former Texas Rangers who they want to start like a cattle ranch essentially in Montana, but they're all the way in. I think I forgot where the story starts. I think it's at the border to Mexico. So they're former Texas Rangers, I guess, retired in Texas, and they have to take like, you know, several hundred head of cattle across the country, and there's dangers and there's romance and there's heartbreak, and it's just incredible. It's the I watch it like once a year. I think it's brilliant. I can't believe, Gigi, you and I haven't discussed that you've seen that. That's funny. But yes, that gets the highest recommendation. The only hesitation I have, Tom, is that after you watch it, other westerns won't seem that good. Like it's almost like you're starting at like the peak western, and then everything else is going to be like, okay, yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's like starting anime with Cowboy Bebop.
Yeah,
Or sorry,
exactly.
not Cowboy Bebop, Code Geass, right? It's
Yeah,
like this is the pinnacle.
yeah.
It's all downhill from here.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, Lonesome Dove is it's also a great book if you want to read it instead of watch it. But the miniseries is gorgeous. It's yeah, it's a masterpiece. I've never shown it to somebody and not had them love it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I've got it on my list here.
Yeah, it's free too. It's on YouTube. I think it's public domain or something.
Nice.
But yeah, I want to touch upon what you said about King Arthur. I think that's really interesting about what you said about King David, because how familiar are you with the pre-Christian version of Arthur that existed before, before Britain was sort of turned into a Christian country?
I'm not that well. So there's some discussion about how long Britain was Christian,
Hmm.
because there's some belief that Britain was Christianized basically by like before the apostles had died. There was already Christianity in Britain. Is one school of thought
Really?
that that Christianity got there really because the Pope sent uh, a delegation to Christianize the island in the 450s, and when he got there, he found that there was Christians already there, and they had been Christians for a really long time, in like monasteries and everything. And they didn't have the Bible; they just had belief in Christ, and they would tell the gospel with these little colored beads on bracelets. So I don't know if you ever did
Oh,
vacation Bible school, but like you ever make the little colored beads and like tell the Bible story. Believe it or not, that's a like super ancient practice. It goes
wow,
back to like the misty dawn of the British Isles, or like we don't have good written records because the Saxons burned them all.
man,
So
that's crazy.
yeah, so but it's we're not quite sure. We just kind of have speculation as to when it gets there. There's a tradition that Pontius Pilate actually became a governor in Britain, and brought the gospel and converted and brought the Grail. So that's why the Grail stories are connected with Britain, is that the Christians brought the Grail over right away for whatever reason.
Oh, like they secreted out of Rome. See, that's
Right.
interesting because I it makes sense to me that if Rome, because this sounds like it's even before Rome, well before Rome becomes Christian, that Britain. Um, yeah. See, so what I know, or what I've learned from what people have said about pre-Christian stories of Arthur, is that it was is originally Welsh, and the morality of the character is totally different, because you talked about him as
Mm.
a hero and a king, and but the from what I understand of the pre-Christian almost really pre-literate like spoken word version of the story that had been passed down. Arthur he's not really a hero in those stories. He's more of a conqueror. He's actually, ironically, he's closer to what you would think of as Conan the Barbarian, where
Hmm.
he's not a necessarily a good man who's like going out there to try to do the right thing. He's just like, you more worship him for his strength. Like the people around him, it's more like, I think he's described in one text as a blood-drenched conqueror, which really stuck with
That's
me.
very much a Conan character, because Conan does become king
Yeah.
eventually in the stories and loses his kingdom and has to get it back. So very much a David type story, but a very, very violent one. Although David was also blood drenched, right? That's why he wasn't allowed to build the temple. Right? He had to
Yeah.
pay a
That's true.
bride price of 200 Philistine foreskins. It's not exactly a man of peace there.
Yeah, it's also not a great currency. It's not that effective. It's not that effective. I don't know. Yeah, see, that's interesting to me because the minute I saw the transition from the culture changing. Oh, and I also want to comment on what you said about Conan. Yeah, from what I see, okay, so I would say the core conceit or the core philosophy of Conan, the thing that draws people to that story is not the heroic morality; it's the dream of freedom. It's the idea of this untethered freedom that Conan has. He sleeps with who he wants, he kills who he wants, he indulges in whatever pleasure he feels like it, and the fact that he happens to oppose men who are really wicked is just kind of like a part, it's par for the course of being an adventurer. But he's not going out there to destroy evil and to like create a safe place, which it does make him a fun character in some ways because he's kind of would you describe him as a chaotic good or a chaotic neutral, something like that? Um,
Yeah, probably chaotic neutral. It's one of the kind of frustrating things is that with Conan entering the public domain, it's like we want to make a Christian Conan, but you really can't
yeah,
because um, Christianity is a religion of building, right? It's a kingdom ultimately with a king. It's not a chaotic religion. It's a religion of order. And
yeah,
Conan at his core is a non-Christian character, just like the pre-Christian Arthur, right? He's is not a Christian character, right? It's like he's not building, he's destroying or just taking, right? One of the uh a lot of the Conan stories is not him going and rescuing a princess, it's him just robbing a palace.
yeah, which is
Getting
really
like
funny.
oh,
Yeah,
and it turns out that there's evil happening in the palace, and so he's killing people, and those people are evil. But it's like he wasn't there to kill evil; he was there to rob the palace. And at the
yeah.
end of the day, he leaves the palace with treasure. Right? It's like, oh well, I killed some bad guys while I was at
Yeah, no,
it.
it's really funny because one of the stories I just finished reading, I forgot what it was called. It was he goes to like raid this it's like a destroyed civilization where and they're trying to sacrifice this woman to this giant snake. And he rescues her from the snake, but the whole time in his mind he just can't stop thinking about how hot this woman is, and like that's his main
Hmm.
motivation is just like, wow, she's so beautiful, and like that's why I want to not because you know not because he's like, well, obviously I can't let a person get devoured by a giant snake. He's like, okay, well, no, she's got really nice hair, like and he's just like, if I rescue her, maybe, maybe she'll give me some time and attention and I can like, take her with me on my next adventure. She's a good looking woman. And it's like, that's his, and that there's a lot of humor in that. And there's a lot of, a simple kind of blunt joy to him being that like, instinct driven where he just, all he cares about is like the next thing that he wants. But then you see Solomon Kane, and it's like it feels like Robert E. Howard is having a conversation with himself about what he wants in a hero. Because Solomon Kane to me is, I really love, and I bring it up on my channel all the time, and people have to like endure me talking about it all the time. But I really love his moral certitude as a character device because it really it functions as both something that makes him totally incorruptible because he doesn't care about anything earthly. He just cares about what he feels. He sees himself as like the hammer of God made flesh. Um, but it also gives him an interesting sense of pathos, a character flaw that he has to work toward because he, when he's introduced to the African witch doctor, I think Nolanga, who becomes his friend. it's like he has to get over certain prejudices he has and certain ideas he has about the way the universe works, and it's like it's like this conflict between his puritanical faith and also like indulging, when he uses the witch doctor's stick and like the staff. It's like you're watching him have to reconcile the dark mythologies of the world he's seeing with his own religion. But I want to know what you think
Yeah.
of that.
So I have to admit, I have not read all of the Solomon Kane stories
Sure.
yet. So I'm not fully up on the ethos. But one of the interesting things of characters like Solomon Kane is that in some ways they're the angel of death from
Yeah.
the Exodus story.
Mm.
It's very easy to get a picture of God from like a VeggieTales picture of God, and like a children's Sunday school picture of God, which is like, be nice, don't hurt people's feelings. And it's like, that's not the God of the Bible. Right? It's like the God of the Bible sent an angel of death to go and massacre the firstborn of Egypt,
Yeah.
right? And killing evil is a thing that God does, like destroying it um, with violence, right? Fire falling from the heavens, people being devoured by worms. Like, this is a thing that the God of the Bible does, and all those things get edited out of the Sunday school stories, and somehow they don't make VeggieTale stories about it, or when they do, they take all the violence out of it. Like,
Yeah.
oh, they're just throwing slushies at each other. It's
Yeah.
like, that's not what happened in the
Yeah.
Bible.
God gave them a strong talking to.
Yeah. And we don't see the angel of death character portrayed in fiction very often, of like, I have been sent by God to destroy evil. And there's a lot to explore there that's interesting. And I think Solomon Kane isn't exactly an angel of death. I almost feel like your character is closer to that, actually,
Yeah.
uh, where he's just like, you have angered God, and now he has sent his agent to show you what he thinks.
Yeah.
So this Marrow is like the hammer of God, like you said. It's like, at no point is he negotiating, right? At no point is he offering mercy.
Yeah.
It's like the time for negotiation has passed. The time for mercy has passed, and now the time of judgment has come. And in many ways, that is a very scary character. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone who has that personality is immediately intimidating. Even if you're on the right side of the story, he's just someone which is why I wanted him to be somewhat monstrous in his appearance, because it's like, some characters, in my opinion, there's two different types of like the superhero archetype, and I think they're somewhat defined by the Superman Batman relationship, right? Is that you have one character who believes the best way to make the world a better place is through leading by example, and then you have another type of character who thinks the best way to to make the world a better place is to represent the consequences, to become, to strengthen people's fear of consequence, of like what happens when you fall off that path and you become wicked, and they're two very effective ways of altering the world, but one of them is um, aspirational and the other is punitive.
mhm.
Um, yeah.
And it's very ancient. In the Exodus story, at one point, they go to these two mountains, and like, one mountain is the mountain of blessings, and the other mountain is the mountain of curses. And they do a religious ceremony on both of these stories. It's like, if you follow God, there will be blessings. Then they go to the other mountain. It's like, if you don't follow God, there will be curses. Right. So it's like,
Mm.
those two characters are very archetypal, and there's a season for both, right? There's a season for Superman, and then there's a season for Batman.
That's a really interesting way to put it. Honestly, I love that. You see, this is what's so fast. Because would you, before I declare you a biblical scholar, would you think of yourself as being somewhat of a biblical scholar?
No,
No.
I just read the Bible. I'm not a scholar.
Okay, because I mean, even if this is just from reading the Bible, your retention is really impressive, because it's a fairly dense book. So to be able to recall it with this level of like certainty is impressive to me. Because anything outside of fiction, I feel like I often lose it over time. But no, I love that. I love that idea of how would I put this? It's like Black Marrow for me represented not just the that type of character, but a genre of Western, um, which is, you know, you have two main types of Westerns. Essentially, you have your the more modern postmodern Western, which is built around you know, realism. It's more like Deadwood, where they're trying to give you a real taste of what, you know, the complexities and the difficulties of life at that time. And then you have the elemental Western, which is, you know, the one that I really like, which is you using the template of the Western to create a kind of mythology. And typically those characters, typically those stories have that type of character. They have that, you know, the Hammer of God character. You have Pale Rider, which I'm sure you've at least heard of, even if you haven't seen it, which is about like a ghostly gunslinger that comes into a town, and specifically, and he takes the form of a preacher, specifically to, you know, like just completely take apart the corrupt system that's been oppressing these people by, like, you know, killing his way through all these local officials who are really bad guys. Um, and something happened in the past few decades where we lost the elemental Western. We just stopped doing it, and then we just kept making the sort of the modern Western, which is more about the gray morality of the time. And I think people got a little fatigued of that. And I think some of the some of what people attribute to the decline in the Western is actually just people getting tired of a certain type of story that they just like, you know, I don't need to see another story where everybody's a dirtbag. Like, it's just not, you know, I do want to have someone to root for.
Which is so different from the old westerns where the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black hats. Like the moral clarity of the early westerns was very, very overt. And now it's like everybody's evil, but some people are less evil at some times than other people are.
Yeah, which is
And that
exhausting.
it is, it's very fatiguing. It was fun and exciting at first. It's like, oh wow, this is so realistic, it's so gritty,
Yeah,
but it lacks nuance and it lacks those archetypical characters,
yeah,
right? When everything is a shade of gray, there's no interesting contrast, right? Like these paintings or these drawings that you're doing, a lot of the meaning in these drawings comes from the contrast, right? Like contrasting colors, contrasting shades, contrasting characters,
yeah, it's true.
right? Like and you could have that contrast even if you were doing it in black and white, but you couldn't do that contrast if everything was gray all the time. It wouldn't even be a picture.
Yeah,
Right? Everything would blend into itself. It would all be
polar bear in a
camouflage.
snowstorm.
Yeah. And exactly. And so you need that good character for no other reason than to make the evil characters look more evil. You need that evil character for no other reason than to make the good characters look good. But more fundamentally, the writer of the story has to believe that good and evil exist. If they've bought into this Marxist worldview that everything is just power and
Hmm.
colonialism and there's no real right and wrong, there's just the powerful and the powerless, and the powerful do what they will and the powerless suffer what they must. If that's your worldview, then it doesn't you can't use any of these archetypal characters, right?
Yeah,
Part of what makes um Black Mirror an interesting character is his morality. Part of what makes Solomon Kane interesting is his morality. And when you have a morality, you can then struggle with that morality and the implications of that. And the two core ethical questions, which is, am I going to do the right thing? And what is the right thing to do? If you
mm.
don't have a morality, you can't really ask either of those questions, and the answers aren't interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Please continue. I didn't want to interrupt you.
oh, so no, so having that clear morality um, puts you, if you're going to do it right, it puts you in tune with kind of the capital T, capital M morality. So the Bible would say the law of God is written on our hearts, our consciences bearing witness, right? One of the cases for the existence of God is that people throughout time and um, throughout the world have very similar consciences as when it comes to right and wrong. Like you don't often come across societies or cultures with a really different morality. It may be expressed differently,
Mm,
but ultimately you go to India and they're like, we don't kill cows.
right.
But if you dig into that, the reason they don't kill cows is because they believe that murder is wrong, and they believe that the moral law against murder applies to cows for these complicated religious reasons. And so once you ask why enough times, you get to this kind of eternal conscience that we all have, which is why stories that are moral stories are so resonant because people already have a conscience in their hearts. They already know right from wrong. They may try to deny it.
Yeah.
And in fact, they may be very loud in their denials
Yeah.
against that morality. But a good story reminds us of morality and also how we fall short, right? Because this is what's interesting. So you go throughout time, you go throughout the planet, and not only do you find people have a pretty similar moral code place to place, but also there's a sense that they don't live up to their own moral code
Mm.
when you which is universal, right? It's like nobody does the good that they know they should do, and everybody does the evil that they know they ought not to do, right? Not all the time, right? Some people more than others, right? Some people are more a slave to their passions than others, but
Yeah.
even the most self-controlled person, when they are self-reflective, knows that they're failing to live up to the moral code that's in their own heart. And a good story reminds us of that. And I think a lot of the postmodern writers refused to look into that mirror, the mirror of the law of God, because it didn't want to see what it was going to show them. And so they just ignored morality. But the result was that they were writing a story that wasn't nearly as resonant, wasn't nearly as timeless, and wasn't as interesting. And ultimately, they just kept telling the same story over and over again.
Yeah, so that okay, so that's an interesting thing to touch upon is that I feel like a lot of people will talk about they'll talk about avoiding cliche by moving into gray morality, which is like ironic to me because I find it to be quite cliche at this point to have. But I find that really interesting. That do you think that the main function of stories traditionally has been to convey moral context to people over multiple generations?
That's an interesting question. And there's different kinds of stories. And I feel that the most fundamental kind of story is the bedtime story that the parent makes up for the child. And I have, now that I'm a dad, I have children and I tell them bedtime stories. I have um, I have two different literary universes that I tell them stories in. I have Dennis the dog and Katie the kitty cat, which are modern day dog and cat that go on adventures in a modern day neighborhood. Um, and they're kind of geared at like my younger children who really like Dennis and Katie. And then I have uh, Sir um, Sir George, who's based loosely off of Saint George, who is a knight in a kind of light fantasy world. And
Sir George the Dragon Slayer, yes.
yeah, so Sir George, he's not a saint yet, but Sir George has battled dragons, and he's has some friends who are dwarves, and he's romantically interested in a Princess Luna who um and I'm using those stories for two different things. So right now, Sir George is um, fighting dragons and going on adventures, and Princess Luna is at home, and she is learning how the kingdom works. So her dad, the king, is sending her to like go spend a day with a cow rancher who's in learning how to milk cows and learning about dairy production. So it's an opportunity for me to teach my children kind of the fundamentals of economics and how the world works
That's
and where
really
leather comes from. Because
awesome.
a lot of kids these days really have no idea
Yeah.
like how the world works, right? Because that's not really taught in school. And they don't understand supply chains or like how you would make a roof or real basic stuff. And by setting it in a medieval era, I can tell a version of these stories that I actually understand. I couldn't tell you how to make an asphalt shingle, like how to manufacture it, but I could talk about thatching a roof like with straw, right? I could describe that sufficiently.
That's fascinating.
And so Princess Luna is an opportunity for me to teach kind of stories of knowledge, and Sir George is an opportunity for me to teach stories of wisdom, but also for them to just be fun, right? So I don't know if stories have, and also for me to help my kids fall asleep. Right? So
I
like
was gonna
the
say
story,
there's got to be a component in this.
yeah. So the a good story can accomplish multiple goals simultaneously. And I will say my stories aren't great, and they rarely accomplish any of these objectives. Least of all, getting the kids to fall asleep. I'm really, really awful at that. And not because the stories are exciting; it's just that they don't get them sleepy. Uh, so I feel that this act that I'm doing with my children, that telling them a story, a fantasy story, and working in my knowledge and my wisdom and using the story as a way of trying to help them learn lessons that I had to learn the hard way, that this is a very ancient act. I feel like parents have been telling their children these kinds of stories from the very dawn of time. And there've been times when people have like collected the folklore, but one of the things you'll find when you collect folklore is that the stories are really different because the nature of the storytelling is very much adapted to the audience. And in some ways, it's almost more like a role playing game where the game master is telling a story, but it's participatory, right? And the other people at the table are influencing the story, right? That's very much what a bedtime story is like. It's like, no, daddy, he didn't do that, he did this. And you're like, oh, okay, he went this way. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think for authors, getting into a context where they can practice telling stories like this, bedtime stories, I think is really good for them as storytellers. And I've interviewed many authors on my podcast, and I found a lot of them, especially the dads, tell bedtime stories. I don't know if this is a uniquely father thing. I feel like in generations past, mothers were more likely to tell bedtime stories, whereas in modern day, it's more fathers that are telling these stories. But it's a way of communicating all kinds of moral and philosophical and psychological truths. I mean, listen to Jordan Peterson talk about the ancient fairy tales sometime. he can preach a sermon off of the Hansel and Gretel, and he has. So there's a lot of truth embedded in those old stories.
Yeah. I actually I think I know the lecture you're talking about. Yeah, his ability to extrapolate from symbols and like create meaning out of that narrative is really incredible. Yeah, no, I've been following him for a while. I'm looking forward to his next book, by the way. We Who Wrestle with God. He's been building.
Yeah, it's out. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, I haven't read it either, but looking forward to it. You see. Also, I want to. The people in the chat are saying this guy sounds like an awesome dad. I would say that you probably are. You have what, 5 kids now?
4.
4. Okay. Well, maybe by the time this airs. No, yeah, that's so. How old are your kids, if you don't mind my asking?
They're 6, 5, 3, and 6 months.
How did you find time to even talk to me? How was that even possible?
Well, I'm not as good of a dad as y'all might think. They're currently all playing Smash Brothers downstairs on the Switch.
No, no, that's great. God bless them. Have a good time. Yeah. So I mean, because I do feel like there's an aspect of nerd culture that I'm obviously a party to. But that I don't really like, which is that people have sort of lost the thread of who the targets of different stories even are. So, for example, I don't know if you've seen the new Superman trailer. With the dog and everything. Have you seen that? The new James Gunn Superman.
I saw the teaser, and I think I've seen. Yes, yeah, I've seen parts of or most of the new Superman trailer.
Yeah. So the reason I bring that up is because there was a whole discussion around that trailer where I had friends who, and my brothers even, who were, we all grew up loving comic books and superheroes and stuff. And they're like, he's like, well, it just looks like it's going to be like a little kid thing, and he's just like, my older brother was saying that as if that was super disappointing that it would be targeted for children. And I just found that really odd because I was like, well, we were children when we fell in love with the character, and the character is sort of designed as, he's meant to be, I think, primarily accessible to young readers and viewers. I mean, I think it's perfectly okay to love those things as an adult. I do. I love those things, but I think a big problem with the culture is our insistence that the characters need to change with us. They need to like become darker and more mature to match the rate of my understanding of of darkness, and it's like there's a kind of weird selfishness to that where it's like, well, I'm older now and my life got harder because I'm not a kid anymore. So I need this character who flies around with a big red cape. I need him to reflect the angst that I feel, in my 20s or in my 30s. And that always felt odd to me because it's like, well, I'm not saying it's not for you. It should be for anyone, but do you really want to see more Superman movies where that kids can't even see because it scares them? Like, because I know people who their kids didn't like the Zack Snyder Man of Steel Superman movie because they were like, it absolutely terrified them. Like it's just a
Mhm.
terrifying, dark, dismal, gray world. And if you're like a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old, it's like it's not appealing. Um, I'm wondering what you think of that, because I heard a whole thing of I don't know if you've heard of Retro Blasters. I think it's called. He's a toy collector, this guy, and he's a man in his 40s who loves action figures and collects them. But he always maintains, he's like, I understand this is primarily for children. I want people to, I want Star Wars and Superman and all the things to be things that kids can enjoy, because that's really, like, once you take it out of that context, it kind of loses the strength of its inception. It becomes something strange and sort of like a Frankenstein creature. It doesn't fit in its own world anymore. But sorry, I've rambled a bit. Go ahead. I want you to.
No, this is a very, very important element of writing, and one that is not taught in writing school if you have a postmodern teacher, which is the importance of adapting your art for your audience. And often authors don't even start thinking about their reader until the book is finished and it's time to do marketing.
Mm.
And so they've written the book and then they start listening to my podcast. And it's like the book that you wrote before you started listening to my podcast, you need to put away and not publish for 5 years. You need to write a new book that's actually for a reader, to appeal to the reader. And the technique that I teach and talk about on novel marketing, and for those of you who listen to the podcast, you know where I'm going with this, is not just to have a target demographic in mind, but to actually have a target reader, a specific person.
Yeah.
I call this finding your Timothy. And it's from the book in the Bible, the books of the Bible, First and Second Timothy, which were written to a specific person, an actual individual. And this is actually somewhat common in the New Testament, that there was a really specific target reader. And when you look at the stories of famous authors, you start to find that this is actually pretty common. So Tolkien wrote The Hobbit for one person, Christopher Tolkien. And it was about thrilling Christopher Tolkien. If he could thrill Christopher Tolkien, the book would be a success. But, and this is what's really important, if he could thrill Christopher Tolkien, he could thrill other people. My name is not Christopher Tolkien, but I loved The Hobbit.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is that narrowly focused stories often outperform broadly focused stories in terms of sales. In fact, I pulled up the box office numbers for the 2025 box office. So as we're recording this, it's April 30th. And what do you think got more ticket sales? Captain America, A Brave New World, a movie for everyone, or a Minecraft movie, a movie specifically for nerdy teenage boys?
Well, we all know the answer to that.
Not only has the Minecraft movie performed better than this broad targeted Captain America Brave New World, it's performed twice as good. Wow. And it has many more weeks in the theaters to go. So Captain America Brave New World has sold every ticket it's going to sell at this point. It's out of the theaters. Minecraft is still active, and it's already surpassed by 2, or almost 2, and actually more than 2 if you include. It's right at 2 if you include worldwide. This broadly targeted film, and for people who don't understand marketing, this is very counterintuitive, because you would think, the more people I target with my art, the more readers I will have, the more people watching my movie I will have, the more people looking at my art I will have, and that's not true, especially in this world of millions of artists and millions of books. People are only going to read the very best book for them at that moment. If there's another book that's better for them, they're going to read that instead. And so you have to focus. Now, half of the sales for Minecraft are people who hate watching Minecraft. It's parents that are being drugged to the theater with their 12-year-old boy because they don't want to drop the kid off at the theater alone. And so they're sitting and suffering through Minecraft, which is why the cinema scores are relatively low, because parents hate going to this movie. But their son is standing up and shouting chicken jockey and throwing his popcorn all over the stadium, and it's just going crazy. And that is the secret to commercial success, because if you can thrill the 12-year-old boy enough, you don't just sell a ticket to the 12-year-old boy, you also sell a ticket to his mom. He will drag his mom to the theater. And this was the success of Harry Potter, right? This book, which was also targeting 12-year-old boys. Hollywood used to be a whole engine specifically targeted at young teenage boys because there was this view: if you could get them, you get everyone, and that's actually not entirely wrong. There's actually a lot of truth to that. If you can get this particular demographic excited in your story, you'll get a lot of other people, either because that 12-year-old boy spreads the word and becomes an evangelist, right? We were all evangelists for something when we were 12 years old. I was an evangelist for Star Wars and Linux, which gives you an idea of kind of my nerdy background. But or trains, or the T-34 tank versus the Panzer II, right? Like boys pick something to get nerdy about, or why their football team is better than your football team. And they'll drag you to the game. They'll drag you to the show. They will buy you or loan you their comic book. And it's not about kind of quietly pleasing lots of people. It's about thrilling a small group of people to the point where they won't shut up about your stuff. And then it's having those fanatical fans, right? The fan is short for fanatic, right? Like, somebody likes your Superman movie, they're not a fan. They're only a fan if their love for your creation is fanatical.
Yeah. Well, and people pointed to the Barbie movie as something that was a good example of that, because I personally have no interest in that. But that movie knew exactly who its audience was, and it went hard for it. It's like everything is pink, and everything. They're not just targeting women, they were targeting a very specific, and even though like people like me, please don't ever make me watch it. There is someone for whom that scratches an itch really intensely. And at the same time, they released Oppenheimer, the whole Barbieheimer thing. And I think I would say Oppenheimer, while obviously more appealing for people who like history, probably because of the fact that it's a Christopher Nolan film, is more of an event that people who would never really watch that stuff will probably end up watching it, because he's kind of become this, not kind of, he has absolutely become a household name. So he can kind of make whatever he wants, and it'll be some sort of a wide event, that people will go see. Which actually brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask. Have you seen any? What do you think? What do you make of Christopher Nolan doing the Odyssey?
By Homer.
Yeah, Homer's
sequel,
Odyssey.
the Iliad.
Yeah.
I think he could do a good job. The key to success with Barbie was that it was a movie for people who loved Barbie. It was a Barbie movie for people who loved Barbie. And often what Hollywood does is they will do an X movie for people who don't like X, right? This is a Star Wars movie for people who don't like Star Wars, with the view that this will expand the Star Wars fan base, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have enough women come into our Marvel movies, so we're going to make a movie for women who don't like Marvel. And so they make the Marvels, and women don't go see it. Because if somebody doesn't like your genre, they're not going to like your genre.
Yeah.
And if you want to be successful, you need to be successful with people that love your genre, that includes the inside jokes, that gives that Barbie fan or that Minecraft fan an opportunity to talk to the person they drug to the theater with and explain all the intricate details that their friend didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
If you take out all the intricate details where there's nothing to talk about afterwards, you just killed the virality of your story. When you watch the old Marvel stories, pointing out Stan Lee was like one of the fun things. The nerd be like, oh, that's the guy who created Spider-Man, right? That old man in that one scene, right? It was this fun little Easter egg. And there was a lot of things like that. And I think with the Odyssey, you have to realize that there's an audience of people who really love that story and who really love that whole world, and understand that this is one of the foundational myths of Western civilization. So Western civilization is kind of a blending of Greco-Roman culture with Judeo-Christian culture, right? It's the interplay of those things that uphold Western civilization. And so you have to be respectful. You can't make Aslan a woman.
Oh, isn't that what they're doing now? Yeah, they're doing a female. Well, it's not even just that Aslan. It's the woman making it is the one, I believe, who isn't it the same woman who made Barbie is doing.
Yeah.
Which is like, that is such a strange pairing. It's like she's just gonna deconstruct it. Like she's gonna turn it into I mean, there's no way she sees eye to eye with C.S. Lewis or
Right.
or even respects that dude's worldview. That to me was like, even from a business standpoint, like even putting aside my personal beliefs about, her ideology or C.S. Lewis's religion, or like taking that out of it, from a business standpoint, why would you do that? Like that is money down the, like, you're not going to make anybody happy. People, you might get a certain chunk of the audience that will maybe see it because they like her and she's kind of like viral now, so like whatever she does they'll go see. But there's going to be a big number of people that are like, I don't really want to see a talking animal, I don't care what that is. And then you have people like us who, like C.S. Lewis's writing, who are like, I don't want to see that director tackle that property. Like that's not a good. I think Christopher Nolan doing the Odyssey is a better fit because he's some of the things he's wanted to do I think are really interesting. Like he wants to from what I understand, the scenes with the Cyclops, he's going to be doing it full animatronic, no CGI. So they're building all this crazy stuff to like have it all done in camera, which I think is going to be. I wanted to see that for like 15, 20 years because it's been just CGI sludge over and over for a long time. But yeah, that to me, but at this point, you talk about the new Chronicles of Narnia, how it's going to be a direct sequel apparently, but that choice was designed to go viral by making people angry. So it's like,
Right.
I have no desire to even feed into it by giving them what they want and being annoyed at that, like because it's like there's so many directors I can think of off the top of my head that would do an amazing job with that property and who probably would clamor to work on it.
Yeah.
But you're giving it to somebody who probably doesn't even like fantasy as a genre.
I mean, part of the reason why Peter Jackson did such a good job
Yeah.
with The Lord of the Rings was that not only did he love the books himself, but he surrounded himself with people who loved the books.
Yeah.
And so it was a film it was an X for people who love X, right? It was a Lord of the Rings movie for people who love Lord of the Rings. He wasn't trying to expand the audience. He was trying to thrill the audience. And and this is the thing Hollywood doesn't understand. If you can thrill the audience, they bring their friends.
Yeah.
But if you make them angry, they tell their friends not to watch it.
Well, word of mouth is still the most powerful thing that there is. I mean, it's still, it seems to be. I mean, like how many, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen where a movie will pick up on a second weekend or a third weekend simply because, word got around that it was better than people thought it was going to be,
And it's more likely to happen with a narrowly targeted audience.
Yeah.
So Sinners, which is currently number 3 in the box office, it's only been in the theaters for 2 weeks. It saw basically no decline from week 1 to week 2. The same with The King of Kings, which is, I think it's number 5 or 6 in the box office overall. These were both very different films, but they were very narrowly targeted, right? You can look at the posters of both of those movies and know exactly who it's for and who they're trying to attract with this film. And it did really well. And having the courage to say, I'm not for everyone, but I am for this group of people, and I'm going to make something that they absolutely love. If you have that creative courage, commercial success is a lot easier to find.
Yeah, and I think another component to the conversation about why it's dumb to chase a certain audience is because the people who like, for example, Star Wars, they like it all. Like there was this weird conversation about like, well, we have to make it more accessible to certain people, and like that's great and all, but like the people who like Star Wars was a weird thing to do that with because it was already so universally loved by so many people. I just don't understand. Like that was always odd to me, but I feel like that's, I'm sure there's enough people talking about that to death. So YouTube has a whole cottage industry, people complaining about the current state of Star Wars. Here I am with my little lemonade stand talking about it. I don't even want to, but yeah, no, I want to ask you, I want to take a little bit of a left turn here. Well, before I ask you this question, I want to address the chat real quick. Guys, how's my audio? Is it okay? I'm a little worried about how clear I'm coming through. I can't quite tell. OBS is a little strange right now, so you guys let me know.
Is that a blue snowball?
Where?
Is your microphone? Is that a blue snowball?
It's an Apple mic.
Okay.
Is a blue snowball? Is that a certain brand?
Yeah, it's another circular microphone like that one.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, you're watching the stream. Okay, great. I was like, well, how does he know? Was it purely based on the sound? That's incredible. I was going to ask, what other than telling stories for your children, what other writing projects do you have right now? I would love to know.
So I'm in kind of an interesting place in the publishing industry. So I've been working with authors for 15 plus years, and my bona fides are not that I am an author myself. I feel like I'm often the only person in the room representing the reader. So
Yeah.
I've read or listened to the audiobooks over 1,000 books since I've graduated from college. So I read a lot, and I try to remember what I read, but I don't myself, other than telling my children bedtime stories and the small narrative things that I'll work into podcasts and what have you. I don't do a lot of storytelling myself.
Yeah.
Um, so I talk history a lot. I love the narrative elements of that, but I'm more of a reader than I am a writer in terms of like where I am in the industry. But I'm a reader who has a lot of access to top authors because I host these popular podcasts. So I've had a
Yeah.
chance to talk with, many best-selling authors about what made them successful and about their writing process and um, specific elements of what they do. And I've worked with a lot of best-selling authors in terms of like taking their books to market and helping them shape their stories to be the kind of story that will resonate and resonate. Lately I've been talking more and more about culture and zeitgeist and how culture changes and how to make a story that will resonate when your book comes out and not when you first had the idea for your book 5 years ago.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
culture changes, and it's important to kind of keep up with those changes in culture. Because there was going back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Western was like the superhero movies of the 1960s, right? Like
Yeah.
every movie was a Western. They just kept making the same stories over and over again. And then those stopped resonating, just like superhero fatigue has kicked in.
Yeah. Well, something that's really interesting is I had heard an interesting analysis of that, which is that westerns tend to gain popularity during certain times in culture, like during certain cycles. And one of them is that whenever people feel particularly hemmed in by economic or social limits, the Western props up again as like an escape for people, which is why it had a bit of a resurgence in the 90s. People were saying that like it correlated pretty well with the housing crisis and like the stock market had a little crash. And then you see a pop up, you see Tombstone, you see the Wyatt Earp film, you see Dances with Wolves, the Deadwood at the late 90s, early 2000s becomes popular. And that's why the Western's kind of seeing a little bit of a renaissance now with the Yellowstone and things like that. But someone had pointed out like we're still doing specifically the morally gray Western, and it's like if somebody made the elemental Western of the good versus evil taking place in some town, you would see probably a huge bump in your audience. I would imagine. I don't know.
One of the number one things that causes me to stop watching a show is the protagonist or the hero making moral decisions that I disagree with.
Mm.
Like I just bounce. And I don't know if I'm unique in that. Y'all in the chat can tell me if you do this as well. But like it's why I didn't like playing Red Dead Redemption 2. Like that
Oh,
game is a masterpiece technically, right? It's beautiful. They simulate everything down to like your beard and like how much food you eat in the game affects like how heavy your character is. Like
yeah.
it's a masterpiece.
If you smoke too many cigars, you have bad stamina when you're chasing people. It's like really. Did you know that?
No, but I believe it. And yet you play as this outlaw, and I didn't enjoy playing as the outlaw. Like I like games like a Bethesda game that gives you a choice. You can play a virtuous path, or you can play a criminal path. But the Red Dead Redemption was too much on rails for me,
Yeah,
and
it
so even
advertises
though
itself as being all this choice, but in the end, you're very much hemmed into very particular decisions.
yeah, you're forced to kill people, and I'm like, but I don't want to kill that person.
Yeah. Well, for me, I always lose. I lost interest. I kept wanting to love that game because it is beautiful and it's like the kind of thing where I could imagine myself getting totally lost in it, kind of like Ghost of Tsushima, where I was like I could just play for hours. But I disliked. Well, the gameplay also I found really clumsy for one thing. I just found like every time there was a shootout, it was like my character was like I felt like I was moving through soup. Like I just couldn't draw my gun in time. Um,
Hmm.
and maybe that's just me being, skill issue, as the kids would say. But yeah, I really disliked how it's like the first mission you go on is to find some guy who owes you money and you beat him up in front of his wife. It's like, it's not exactly why I play video games. I'm not looking, yes, finally the power fantasy of beating up a man who's like really low on his, he's at the lowest point of his life, and I'm going to emasculate him at his home in front of his kids. It's perfect
Yeah.
escapism for me, It's like,
And there is, I think for some people that is, I actually know, I have a friend who that is what he loves. He loves playing the evil playthrough of a Fallout game or a Skyrim, right? Because he
yeah,
wants to be able to live that evil fantasy. And for people like that, I feel like there's a lot of media that's right up their alley. But if you're wanting to play that virtuous fantasy, right? The Arthur is the good and virtuous king.
yeah,
There's not a lot of media for you right now,
no,
and
there isn't.
certainly not a lot of like Hollywood media, right? Like everything is so morally gray. There's not a lot. It's like, gosh, give me a good man to root for. It's like you can't root for Luke Skywalker anymore. He's a coward.
Oh, yeah,
And he's evil, right? It's like even the good men that you were rooting for as a kid have been deconstructed, and there haven't been new heroes to take their place. And we can bemoan this, but it's actually a great opportunity, right? Those heroes of the future are, maybe it'll be Black Mirror, maybe it'll be Arthur. There hasn't been a good Arthur story told in a long time, because the people telling Arthur stories don't understand Arthur as a character. And you can't really understand Arthur as a character if you're not looking at David. You can't understand Merlin if you don't understand Samuel. You
yeah,
can't understand um, uh, Lancelot if you don't understand Joab, right? Like
yeah,
these parallels are really strong, and so you can't just. It's kind of like the founding fathers. You can't just look at them to understand the Constitution. You have to look at what they were reading, right? You have to read John Locke. You have to go one step back, and I feel like for whatever authors are willing to do that and really understand Arthur as a character and understand what part of the Arthurian story is resonant right now, because I think the part that's resonant in the zeitgeist is not the Morte Arthur. It's not the betrayal of Lancelot. It is Arthur at the very beginning, basically reinventing government and saying, we are going to create a kingdom that is built on laws where no man sits above the others. We're going to have a round table. I'm not going to be sitting on a throne. I'm seated at a round table where I'm equal with my knights, and we're going to work together to fight back against the evil that is invading this nation.
yeah.
And I think that's the story that people are hungry for right now.
Yeah, no, I firmly, completely agree. I actually, when I first started working on this with my co-writer, I had a co-writer in the beginning, but then he had his first kid, so obviously, time, time was not plentiful. He's very time poor, as you'd say. So
Yeah.
he helped me plot it out in the beginning, and then I just kind of took over writing duties. And now he kind of functions as an editor, where I like send him the scripts that I'm working on and the pages as they come in, so he can just tell me if it's crap or if it works. But I the thing we both agreed on, and if we didn't agree on it, I probably couldn't have collaborated with him, is that we were both like, immediately we're like, okay, how are we going to handle the Lancelot thing? And we had a plan for it, to do it in a way that would acknowledge that story from the Renaissance, but also treat it how I think it deserves to be treated, which is that it's essentially fan fiction that was written like 400 years after the original legend.
Right.
And it's
Sir Gawain was by far the number one knight in the oldest tales.
yeah. Lancelot is really a self-insert by a particular writer who wanted to like steal Arthur's girl and outperform him in every. It's really, that's what it is. If you look at it in context, it's and this is like I have this running theme where it's like, this was basically the Marvel comics of the heroes who overlap, but they also have their own adventures, and then you have different writers coming in over time and adding to or adjusting, retconning the work of writers who had worked on the same story before them. And so that's how you get Lancelot, coming in and suddenly becoming the hero of Camelot, and Arthur has kind of become almost an antagonist. He exists purely to get in the way of this love story. Which was always frustrating to me, because I was like, that's the thing a lot of people know about Arthur, is that he got cuckolded by his best friend, which is just like the least interesting thing about him. Um,
Yeah.
and it's very, and so the mission statement of this graphic novel has been like, I want to, I can't portray it, quote unquote, as I think they would have back then, because obviously their entire sensibility, their visual taste, everything is different. But I wanted to take my modern brain and I'll give myself license to indulge in the sensibilities of someone who was like, a 14th century Christian who would have loved this story. So it's like, it's very much of its time, in that the aesthetic is really like hyper colorful in some areas, and the armor is historically accurate to a point, but I also, I indulge in like design that, even the thing I have on screen right now, that's Gawain, and it's like, that's somewhat historically accurate armor, but like the helmet has wings on it, which you wouldn't really do back then, because you don't want to give any, the whole point of medieval armor is that it's smooth. It's like, you don't give your enemy something to grab. You put wings on a helmet.
And wings are really tricky. Like just from a straight up blacksmithing job, you're doubling or tripling the cost of your helmet for no advantage, right? It's easy for you to draw wings
Yeah.
onto the helmet, but could you imagine like affixing those wings while hammering it with a hammer, right?
Yeah.
Like suddenly the geometry of the helmet becomes just dramatically more complex.
Yeah. Oh god, wait till you see Arthur's wings on his helmet. It's like it's absurd. It's purely impractical. It's purely for just the aesthetic joy of just like how cool he looks, But yeah, no. So the mission statement was like, to the people, who enjoyed these stories hundreds of years ago, it was like, this was their Justice League. This was their escape into moral certainty, and to, just like big climactic battles, and so the approach I keep taking with it is like, it's like Sabaton. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sabaton, the band.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. It's like it's heavy metal with this bombastic moral certitude, and I keep feeding off that vibe and putting that back in the book, so that every page of art, it just feels like it could be an album cover, and that's been that's been sort of guiding me through it, because with Black Marrow, it was like, the vibe is like, I wanted to give people a taste of horror. Like, there's a horror element, but I had to fight with my editor back when it was with the publisher, because we had, well, not a fight, but we just had a funny disagreement where he was like, well, no, this is horror. You need to make sure you market this as horror. And I was like, it's not really horror. There's a horror component, but it's really more of a heroic legend. And the horror is just there to be something for Black Marrow to kill.
Yeah, it's not actually horror at all. Just the same way that Doom is not a horror video game. So in horror, the agency is with the evil, and the good characters are fleeing evil. In Doom, it's like you're not trapped in hell with demons. The demons are trapped in hell with you.
Yeah, which is great. That's why I keep coming back to that world. I love that game so much. It's incredible.
Yeah, and so it's very much not horror. But one other way to think of Arthur is as a founding myth for people. So Arthur has haunted the kings of England for over 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Right. There's this kind of mythical, good and just king that the kings of England and France actually have been held to the standard of. And and it's very interesting that England has never had a King Arthur. We've had a President Arthur in the United States, but they've never had a King Arthur, and it's not for want of trying. But every time they name a child Arthur, he doesn't become king for whatever reason. It's very interesting. So he's the founding myth. He's the myth that all of the kings are compared to. Compare that with the Kingdom of Russia. Who is the founding myth that the Russian kings were compared to? I'll give you a clue. They call themselves czars, which is named after Caesar. So they're all modeling themselves after Julius Caesar, who was not a good king. He was a corrupt, evil king who overthrew the republic and, destroyed the nation in order to save it. Right there, and they're not modeling themselves after Augustus, who kind of restored the old ways and brought virtue and goodness back to the kingdom. It's Julius Caesar specifically. Right? They don't call themselves Augustans; they call themselves czars. And the oppression of the Russian people, which has been perpetual, right? Like, sure, they were oppressed by the communists, but it wasn't exactly great before that, right? When Vladimir Putin is one of the best leaders you've had in the last 500 years, you've had some awful leaders, right? It's just series of tyrant after tyrant.
Yeah.
But But part of the reason why they've had these awful times, and I'm not justifying Putin, by the way, he's awful, but
Oh, I
so
understand.
was Tsar Nicholas and the other Tsar Nicholas, and Stalin was pretty bad. Stalin was awful, and Lenin was awful. Like Khrushchev, like they've just had just awful leaders. But when you compare those leaders to uh, Caesar, who genocided all of France, right? He went in and created a desert and called it peace. Just killed whole people groups. Suddenly, the communists killing whole people groups starts to make more sense. So
Mm.
the myths that define us as a people really affect how good or evil of a people we are. And the English people are really blessed to have King Arthur as the mythical king. The king who doesn't sit on a high throne and oppress his people. He sits at a round table equal with his knights, and who fights alongside his knights to ensure that justice is preserved and evil is vanquished, right? Like that is a really powerful founding myth, and one that we have to fight to preserve, because if you don't have Arthur, you have Caesar, and Caesar is worse in every way.
Yeah, that's yeah. I really I feel like I had this experience when I listened to your podcast. I feel like I could just listen to you talk for like 12 hours straight, like an ambience. I just your retention of history is really impressive to me. I mean because I read a lot of history, but then when I recall it, it's kind of like trying to remember a dream. Um, and I also want to let you know that I don't know if you're seeing the chat, but the chat loves you. um,
I love you too, chat.
Edgar says, "Hi, Tom. We love you now." Whatever you said at that particular point earned you their eternal admiration. No, I really love that. I think that rings very true to me. And there was something that you had said that I wanted to address. I lost the thread of it but it was something. Oh, I'm gonna forget it. You know what? Keep if it pops up, I might jump in and interrupt you. But please continue with your train. Unless were you done with that train of thought? I don't want to.
Well, I can do one more founding myth for some comparison.
Okay.
So it's interesting that Americans are fighting so hard to preserve Arthur as a character, because he's not actually our founding myth.
No.
uh, we're not a kingdom. We appreciate Arthur as a character, but President Arthur, most people couldn't say anything about him. In fact, I think we'd struggle to even place which decade he was in, which isn't true with all presidents, right? But he wasn't a defining president for us. So, who is our um, mythical figure, the kind of the father of our nation? It's George Washington. And George Washington, though, had a mythical figure that he was looking to, that was his inspiration, and that was a Roman by the name of Cincinnatus. The founding fathers had a really high view of Cincinnatus, and they named a major city after him. In fact, Cincinnati was called Fort Washington before it was called Cincinnati. That's how much
Mm.
Washington was seen as the second Cincinnatus. So, do you know the story of Cincinnatus?
Oh, before I answer that, I remembered what I want to tell you. When you're done, ask me about Glastonbury Abbey. And
Okay,
continue.
I'll make it. So, Cincinnatus. Actually, real quick, let me explain how the Roman system worked during the Republican time.
Do it.
They were led by two consuls that served for 1 year. Then they'd have elections, and those guys couldn't run again for 10 years, so they'd have two new consuls. The Romans were terrified of having a king again. They were terrified of supreme executive power sitting in the hands of just one man. But they acknowledged the fact that sometimes emergencies happen and you need just one guy to make the shots. And so they had this emergency provision in their constitution, which called for appointing a dictator, which is where we get the word, who would serve for 6 months max to solve the crisis, whatever the crisis was. And if they added a dictator, if the Senate voted to appoint a dictator, the dictator would sit above the consuls.
And if I remember correctly, not to spoil the ending, but if I remember correctly, he did not give up his power, did he?
Who?
Well, when Caesar did this, didn't he end up not giving up his power?
Yes. So this is Julius Caesar's defining characteristic,
Okay.
was that he was the first ever person to be appointed dictator for life, which isn't a thing, right? Dictators only serve for 6 months. First, he was dictator for 10 years, and then he became dictator for life. So that's the Russian founding myth. But the American founding myth, we don't look to Caesar, we look to Cincinnatus. And so Cincinnatus was called on, some neighbors of Rome, this is when Rome was just a city, where it's fighting, and the consuls march out to meet them. I think I forget who they were. It was one of the Latin peoples in nearby Rome. The consuls march out to fight them, and the consuls lose. In fact, their whole army gets smashed. And now that army that just smashed the consular army is marching on Rome. They're going to be here any moment. And there's this guy who was a very successful soldier, but had been bankrupted because of the poor behavior of his sons. And so he's not even wealthy enough to live in the city of Rome. So he's out on his fields. His name is Cincinnatus, but everybody in Rome knows this is the guy. This is the guy who can save us. And so the Senate sends a delegation out to Cincinnatus's field with the purple toga, which only the dictator can wear, and they just put it on him. They're like, "You're a dictator now. You have to save Rome." And so he now has supreme executive power. So he goes to Rome. He appoints a master of the horse, which is this like number 2 guy. He pulls together every veteran. He just starts drafting random veterans from the streets, pulls together an army, marches out to fight the Etruscans or whoever, and defeats them. Huge, glorious battle. He's worthy of a triumph when he comes back. He doesn't take the triumph, which is like marching in with all of your treasures. He's still going to be consul for like 5.5 more months. He can enrich himself during that time legally, right? Because it's a 6-month term. And what does he do? He retires back to his farm. He doesn't use his position to enrich himself, and instead he retires back to his farm. And this is what Washington was thinking about when he retired from being president and blew everyone's minds and set the precedent for the 2-term presidency.
Yeah, because they essentially did offer him what it was, a kingship, and he turned it down because he was like,
right.
We just got done fighting over this, guys. Come on, he was, yeah. So I'm familiar with the story you just told. I actually did not know that it was George Washington's like guiding inspiration for stepping down from what could have essentially been a lifelong dictatorship.
Wow. Right. We'd have had Washington until he died, and then we would have had Jefferson until he died, and the American experiment would have lasted until maybe the 1840s. Yeah, but because Washington stepped down from power, suddenly we don't have presidents for life, which is what you see in almost every other democracy. Right? Like most of these, if you go around the world, you have people who have been president forever, right? Putin is a great example, right? They had term limits, and so he shifted from prime minister to president, and then he moved all the power over. So he's like stayed in control. His titles changed, but his goal is to be Caesar, not to be Cincinnatus.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. See, that is like a big part of history that I think a lot of people don't realize. It's not just knowing what happened, it's knowing the thematic connection between things. Like, so for example, before I tell you about Glastonbury, just to, there's as I was learning, I did a ton of research for like 2 years before I even started drawing this comic, this King Arthur book. And something that kept popping up was seeing how many different things in history are actually connected in ways that I hadn't realized on, along a timeline of causality. Like a lot of people, everybody knows ancient Rome, and everybody in my life also knows the Middle Ages of Europe, but so few people seem to realize that the Middle Ages of Europe were caused by the collapse of Rome.
Yeah.
It's just not a thing that people think about. And it's like, when I put it together, in terms of the century timeline, it was it was like a kind of an oh duh moment of like, oh yeah, of course, the economy collapses. That's what creates, and then the idea that England was an outpost of Rome, and then that essentially is the beginning of the Arthurian legend because, Britain is essentially naked to invading forces, and then a heroic myth springs from that vulnerability.
That's right, and in the most dramatic way possible, because Britain had been a beacon of stability. They'd been insulated from all of the Roman civil wars because they were an outpost.
Yeah.
And they had a powerful general who had a really powerful Roman garrison, and the island was a beacon of prosperity and peace. And then that Roman general realized that Rome had smashed itself so badly that he took all of his troops, marched on Rome, made himself emperor, and Britain was left to their own devices. And the Saxons were like, "It's a nice island you have there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it." And the
Yeah.
Britons are like, hey, Rome, can you come give us protection? And Rome's like, we're busy in the Middle East. We can't help.
Yeah.
Figure it out. And
We're
they're like, we really could use some protection. And then
yeah.
the historical record goes dark. And maybe there was a guy named Arthur who helped him out. We're not quite sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, I like that Rome at that point is kind of like the later seasons of The Office, where Dunder Mifflin's like corporate collapse. They're like, you guys just manage yourself for a bit. We're busy.
We're busy.
We got some money problems over here.
We just had 3 emperors this year. We can't deal with your problems right now.
Oh my god, yeah, I was reading about this series of books called Byzantium. I forgot the name of the writer, but it's about the the leading to the end of Rome, and it's about those last few centuries of the empire. And my goodness, it was chaos, the fall of Rome. I mean, it is a centuries of just things getting worse and worse. And yeah, every 15 minutes the emperor is slain and a new emperor takes. It's like, why would you even want that job? After a while, it's like if you see your last 3 4 predecessors all just get turned to dust and be like, I'd rather just I'd rather live on my olive farm, my olive garden. But yeah,
there was this
sorry, go
one
ahead,
emperor named Diocletian
yeah,
who had been a pretty successful emperor and kind of brought a little bit of stability in the midst of this really long decline. And he was like, the one thing that will cap off my Caesarship is for me to retire like Cincinnatus. And so he does. He retires like Cincinnatus, trying to be, Washington wasn't the first person inspired by
sure,
Cincinnatus.
sure.
And the empire almost immediately goes into chaos. They're like, Diocletian, please come back and save us. And he's like, have you seen the turnips that I'm growing? He's like, I hate that job.
Yeah, he's like, but I already did that. Yeah, he doesn't want to do that again. That's really. Have you seen the turnips that I'm growing? Yeah, I mean, it's like once you see what happens to people who don't step down from the throne. I mean, he wants to see his kids grow up. He was the wisest person in that whole story, really. So I brought up the legend of Glastonbury. It was something you had said. Oh, because you were talking about how the myth of Arthur kind of hangs over the heads of England's rulers. So, are you familiar with the story of Glastonbury Abbey?
I'm not.
Oh, you're gonna love this. Everybody, buckle in. I love this story. This is like this gave me a very strong design direction to go in for the King Arthur book that I'm drawing right now in real time. Because the reason I'm only 15 pages into this because I redrew a big portion of it because after I heard about Glastonbury Abbey, I changed the aesthetic of Arthur of what he's going to look like. So, in keeping with what you had just explained, the legend of Arthur looms big over the rulers of England throughout history. And there was one, and I can't remember the name of the king. This is where if I had Thomas's brain, I could just recall his name. But I have my brain, and my brain is kind of like, it's like that Always Sunny in Philadelphia, like Pepe Sylvia map. It's just a bunch of things plastered against the wall. Essentially, this king, he's not a native Englishman. I believe he was either a Saxon or I think he was a Norman. But essentially, he hears of the story of King Arthur and he gets really into it. He's like, oh, this is a pretty cool legend. I like this a lot. This guy was like a superhero king. This is totally badass. And he's like, well, I like this story, but I don't like that the people of this, country keep talking about how he's the once and future king. This idea that he's going to come again, because that makes me, feel like I'm, nothing more than a regent or a steward. Right. So, but he's a very good diplomat because he talks to the people of England and he says, hey, listen, I like this legend. I think this king was cool. I'm going to honor your culture by finding where he's buried and giving him a heroic, a heroic burial and a place of great reverence, because his body was, according to the legend, they hid his body because of, Saxon invaders. And then, so he essentially goes on, like an adventure with some guys to try to find the reported birthplace of this legendary Arthur. And I don't remember exactly what happens at the very end, but I do know that that's essentially the story of Glastonbury Abbey. Was that these monks at this abbey in Glastonbury claimed that they had discovered his tomb, that it was buried in a humble place beneath this the abbey, and And the way they told the story is really interesting because it has just enough just enough believability to make it kind of juicy, where it feels like it could be real. Um, that it was not, if it was if it was bad fiction, they would have like stumbled onto the tomb and it's like lined with gold and there's like a choir of angels singing. But instead, they're digging beneath this abbey where he was supposedly buried, and they hit the wood of a simple coffin, and the monks open it and they find him and Guinevere buried together. Who they assume is Guinevere. This woman, a normal sized woman, but they just say that the body of the man, who they assume is Arthur, was humongous. They said that his forearm was the length of a shin bone of a normal man. Like it was just huge. So this essentially the largest monk at the abbey, who was already a huge guy, apparently he was standing next to it, and they said by comparison Arthur just was huge. He was a giant. So they supposedly try to move the body and bury it someplace else, and Glastonbury now is considered a holy site where you visit it, and they claim that this is the spot where they found his body. But I love that legend so much because I love the idea that Arthur is he's almost a giant. I mean, it's like because according to some of the historians I've listened to, they talk about how Excalibur as the sword, the great weapon. That's something that wasn't necessarily in the initial vision of the character, because Excalibur, I believe, or Caliburn, was the original Celtic name, which I think just means sword. And so it's essentially like the idea that the sword was great significance over time. That was something that kind of grew over time, and the idea that someone has a great sword, a great weapon, could be a misinterpretation that they're saying someone is just very powerful physically, like they exist in a powerful way. So what we consider Excalibur could have just been something over many centuries, that what they essentially were trying to say is that guy is really tough. He's
Mm-hmm.
really big and he's really tough. And that, as an artist, that really excited me, because then I realized, like, oh, that's what I want to do with Arthur. I want him to be like a tempest, he's like a half giant almost, he's like an 8 foot tall man. But anyways,
Which makes him a bit of a King Saul type character.
yes.
Because before uh, David was fighting against the Philistines and bringing peace to the kingdom, King Saul was doing the exact same thing. And King Saul was described as being head and shoulders taller than everyone else, which makes Saul very much a tragic figure, right? He falls to his own um, sinful desires when he could have had a dynasty that would have lasted forever. But he was a good and virtuous king before he became an evil tyrant.
Hmm. What causes the downfall of Saul? I don't remember this story so well.
So Saul um, is very powerful, and he does a very good job at defeating Israel's enemies, but he does a poor job trusting God, and he's not very patient. And
Mm.
so instead of waiting for Samuel to come and do the sacrifices, Saul does it himself, even though that's not the role of a king. So there was in the Israelite constitution, which they actually had. We don't have it, but they had a constitutional monarchy. So when Samuel appoints Saul or anoints him as the king, one of the things he does is he writes down in the scroll all of the duties of a king, right? So they had an actual written constitution. It
Oh,
was a
cool.
constitutional monarchy. But in the Israelite model, you can kind of look and kind of piece together pieces of the constitution just by looking. And they had kind of three branches. They had the king, the role of the king.
Mm-hmm.
They had the role of the priest. So the king does war and kind of manages taxes and that sort of thing. The priest manages the religious element of the kingdom
Mm-hmm.
and the priesthood, and they specifically regarding worship around the temple. And they would also handle some elements of justice in the earlier system under the judges. And then they had this third branch of government, which I guess we would call the fifth estate in the United States, which was the prophets, who stood outside of the power structure. So prophets didn't have power, and they were like gadflies pointing out what everyone was doing wrong. So very much like the press is supposed to operate in
Yeah.
the American system.
Yeah.
And so like people love the priests, they would often love the king, but nobody loved the prophets, right? The prophets are constantly getting killed because all they're doing is just telling everyone how wicked and evil they are, and holding up the moral standard and being like, you're not living up to your own moral code. And but the prophets also had spiritual power that the priests didn't have. So you don't hear stories of priests doing miracles um, hardly at all in the whole Old Testament. Priests don't do miracles, but prophets do. Not all of them, but a lot of them. There would be miraculous things, and so Merlin is very much a prophet, not a priest,
Hmm.
right down to his clothes. Right, the robe and the staff and the beard, that is straight out of the Old Testament. And very much a Samuel figure, because Samuel is the one who brings about the big turn back to the true God, because it the at the very beginning of the story, before Samuel is born, the word of the Lord is so rare that Samuel's mother, who's praying, the high priest doesn't even recognize the prayer. He just thinks she's drunk because of how corrupt and evil everything had gotten. So Samuel who
Whoa.
actually begins the great return to their original God, and a return to the old ways. And there's this massive revival, spiritual revival in the kingdom, so that it's to the point where there's this saying at the end of First Samuel, it's like, is even Saul among the prophets? Like, even wicked Saul is prophesying. Everyone's a prophet nowadays.
Yeah.
um, but Saul was not a prophet, and he shouldn't have been doing sacrifices, but he did it anyway, and because of that, God cursed him. So he wouldn't obey. So there's a famous line: "Obedience is better than sacrifice." And I've noticed this as a dad. I'm like trying to change a diaper, change a kid's clothes, and I'm like, I need you to lay down on the changing table. And my kid will give me a hug instead. And I'm like, I don't want a hug. I want obedience. We're in a hurry. We're gonna be late. I need to change
Yeah.
your diaper.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's what God was. That's how God felt. It's like, no, I don't want sacrifice. I want you to just listen to me.
Yeah. That's
Stop
brilliant.
worshiping those dadgum idols. How many times do I have to say it? Don't make me come down there. I'll do it. You know I will.
That's great. Well, it's interesting how fatherhood gives you different contexts of ancient stories too, because so many of them would come from a place about like essentially honor your parents. And but yeah, I mean, I get that idea too, that you're like, yeah, that's great, hugs are great, but also like, can you please get the move on so we can get out of here. But you mentioned Merlin. I wanted to touch on that because so Merlin as high as a priest is a really that's a really poignant way of putting it, because I'm sure you're aware, the story behind Merlin, the origin of that character changes along, much like Arthur, it changes with the story as it goes from pagan to Christian, right? So because there's more than one, and I'm trying to figure out. I think I may have figured out how to integrate it into the story in a way that's engaging, into my version, how to get them all in there. And it's essentially, the Celtic or the Druidic version, I should say, of Merlin is this idea, from what I remember, that he was I think, a Celtic soldier who, in some land battle, he had gotten his first taste of the carnage of war, and he ran away from it as a young man, and he wandered into the wild. And over the course of centuries, he lived among the trees, and he learned the language of the birds, and he sort of this very druidic idea of magic, right? That it's like nature based, and that's essentially that was like an aspect of Merlin that was a part of the original story. But once it becomes Christian, the Christians they don't really believe in magic. The idea that anything that's not anything paranormal, that's not just the will of God, is essentially the devil. So then in the Christian tradition, Merlin is he's his father was a demon, and his mother was I think a holy woman who, to prevent him from he was an unholy birth, but then she gets him blessed right away. So he's essentially living in both worlds, where he has powers of dark, but he's a person of good and light. And so interestingly, I don't know which of those I like more, because I think they're both pretty engaging ideas. I like the idea that he's like a character who's always wrestling with having a dualistic nature, but and then I realized, if Merlin's lived as long as he has, maybe there's a part of him that doesn't quite remember which of those is true. Um,
Hmm.
and that incorporating that into the story, where it's like, because one of the things I wanted to touch upon with the Knights of Camelot graphic novel that I'm working on is this idea that Arthur, he represents a joining of the kingdom, right? Like the old Celtic tradition and the new Christian ideas kind of merge a bit, because I mean that's how it is in the story too. You can see when it first becomes a Christian story, it's very heavily Christian, and then over time, as people get more comfortable owning the story, you start to see a reintroduction of the pagan elements, even just as like fodder, or even just philosophically, some elements creep back in, and then you have this like nice merging where it's like you have some pagan fantasy elements with an overarching Christian theme. And I like the idea of incorporating that into the mythos of the comic, where it's like, he's kind of bringing both of those worlds together, and there's a little bit of tension because Merlin represents the pagan origins of the country, and all these knights are Christians that are like, yo, I don't know how comfortable we are with this guy, but essentially learning to trust that his presence is not necessarily an affront to them. He could be, because it's like if you're, especially back then, how religious these guys were. Like, it wouldn't necessarily be such a leap to get to a place where they, reconcile it as being like, well, if God moves through all of us, perhaps to me that. But well, I would say, would you say that leaders throughout history have tried to consciously or unconsciously position themselves in ways that reflect historical heroic legends? Like, I mean,
Oh,
I know that Henry, one of the King Henrys, was obsessed with King Arthur, and he even like made a round table, and it was him and all of his buddies. But I think he was one of the. Wasn't he the same one that executed a bunch of his own wives, or am I getting that confused?
um, I think that may have been a different Henry. The one who executed his wives was Henry VIII,
Yeah.
and Henry VIII certainly did not have a round table, but it may have been Henry V.
Yes.
My I'm not familiar with the story, but my guess is it's Henry V, because Henry V was the first Henry to kind of embrace his English identity, because you had several hundred years where the English kings didn't speak English. So
Mm.
Richard the Lionhearted only spent 11 months in England ever in his whole life. And at no
Wow.
point did he learn English, right? He's seen as this great English king, but he spent more time on crusade than he did actually in England, because he was a French descendant of William the Conqueror who had lands in France, and his French palaces were better, whatever.
Mhm.
King Henry V was the first one to kind of reorient and stop seeing himself as a French king, but as an English king. Uh, but it's absolutely true that leaders will look at historical leaders as a model, and sometimes it's really explicit. Like after Napoleon died, you had leaders posing with their stupid hands in their vests for decades. And Napoleon had his hand in his vest because he had some sort of physical condition where he had pain and he had to like hold himself there. It wasn't like a fashion statement,
Oh,
but
that's
you have like
interesting.
Civil War generals with their hands like tucked into their jackets posing like Napoleon because they want to be the next Napoleon. And so there are certain historical figures that really capture the imagination of subsequent historical figures. And there's only a handful of them. Most people are looking back at Cincinnatus, one of the Caesars, either Julius or Augustus, Charlemagne, Arthur, who's not really historical, and then Napoleon, and then I would say Washington slash Cincinnatus. Like, there's not that many. Like, most people are kind of looking back. I think nowadays some people may be looking at Churchill. I don't know who Churchill was looking at. Um, Problem with Churchill was that he was such a student of English history. He was kind of looking at the whole thing, right? He wrote his
Yeah.
own history of England that covered the whole start to finish, soup to nuts.
Churchill is a fascinating historical figure. He. Oh my God, I never get tired of learning new things about him. Um, I've loved that story of when the English apparently there. I mean, I don't know if this is a real conversation or if this is mythologizing of who Churchill was, but there was some conversation where they were like, these powerful men in England are in this room and they're saying, well, we may have to start talking about conditions of surrender. I think this is before America had gotten involved in the war. And Winston Churchill responded, "We will talk about surrender when every man in this room has choked on his own blood," which is just incredible because he had no illusions about the Nazis. He knew
Yeah.
exactly the kind of people he was dealing with. He's like, it's not like they're going to come and just take over and then we'll return to normalcy. Like they will probably wipe out 30% of our country. So he's like, yeah, I think that's the quote. If I don't know if it's real or if that's just a nice work of fiction, but the fact that the idea that he might have said that is so believable to me, considering how he expressed himself. But yeah, no, he's great.
There's a quote about Churchill, and I'm going to butcher it. I was looking up, I couldn't find it. It's like they said he drafted the English language and sent it to war against the Germans.
Oh, absolutely.
And in some ways, I feel like Churchill isn't really in the model of another leader. He was his own. He and you get these occasionally, right? Napoleon was trying to be Caesar, right? He was in fact to the point where he like made himself consul first before he made himself emperor,
Mm-hmm.
and he was really trying to follow in that Caesar Charlemagne tradition. But Churchill's not an Arthurian figure, or I don't think. I mean, he was a warrior, but he was like a naval guy, right? Like he's not a Teddy Roosevelt type who's like on the horse charging up the San Juan Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's known more for his rhetoric. These other kind of archetypical leaders aren't really known for their rhetoric, for being really eloquent speakers. Cicero is known for being an eloquent speaker, but he was never in charge of Rome for more than a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of. You should do your next series about Churchill. There's a lot to work with there.
I definitely would. I mean, I like him as a character. I read his biography a few years ago, and it was like I was at the time I was such an annoying boyfriend because I kept like telling my girlfriend everything I was learning about it, and she's now going to be my wife in June.
Oh, congratulations!
So thank you. Thankfully, I didn't annoy her so much that she didn't want to hear anything else. It was that, and Fiorello LaGuardia. I reading about LaGuardia's life was like one of the greatest mayors ever. But I wanted to know what is your schedule like? When do you have to leave? Are you good to stay for a bit, or do you want to go? I don't want to keep you.
My wife has texted me that she is needing some reinforcements with the kids here soon, so I can't stay much longer. But I do love what you're doing with getting back to the archetypical characters and telling more archetypical stories. It's important. It's good to deviate from time to time because we might find new archetypes and right. So you can't just tell the same story over and over again.
Yeah.
But it is important for culture to reset from time to time and go back to those narratives that define who we are as a people, and also to kind of redecide who are we as a people, who are our heroes. Because you can tell a lot about someone by who his heroes are, and the same is true for a people. You can tell a lot about a people by who they celebrate. Do they celebrate tricksters? Do they celebrate warriors? Do they celebrate kings? Do they celebrate artists? And obviously, there's lots of folks that are celebrated. It's not that we have one hero, but there's some heroes that kind of rise above the rest and give definition. And Arthur has defined a people, and I would say specifically the English people, maybe Britain overall. I don't know if the Scots claim Arthur or not. The French do, strangely. Like we have 1066, William the Conqueror comes over, and he smashes the British monarchy, sets himself up as a monarch, and then he conquers the nation more completely than it had ever been conquered before. Because before that, you had a lot of these fractious nobles, and the English crown was pretty weak, relatively speaking. You had these really powerful dukes and earls and barons, and William the Conqueror goes and builds these Norman keeps, which is like the Platonic ideal of a stone castle. It's just this very simple stone tower, and he just builds them on the lands of like all of these nobles, and he controls them with his people. And sometimes he replaces the nobles, sometimes he doesn't, but he like really well and truly conquers England, the last person to ever do it, really, until the modern day. And part of me wonders if part of that project was conquering England culturally, because the language was lost. Um, we go that's the transition from, I think it's Old English to Middle English, because for several hundred years nobody writes in English. He so captures the intellectual class that while English is continuing to be spoken, nobody's even writing in it anymore. And
Mm.
then when King Henry V comes along several hundred years later and is the first English king to start speaking in English, he and tells his scholars to start writing English, but they don't write the Old English. They write English to match how it had been spoken now that it's evolved for 300 years. So you have this big reset in English between Old English and Middle English, where there's a big gap where there's basically no literary record for like 300 years,
Wow.
if I'm remembering
Yeah.
correctly. And uh, and so, like during those 300 years, who's writing Arthurian stories? It's not the English. They're not
Mm.
writing anything. It's only the French, and it's perhaps part of their cultural conquering of the island.
That's interesting. Yeah. Do you think some of it was? It sounds like, I mean, was an aspect of this a critique of the English through French eyes?
Possible. There's a big split. So this time, where you have the Saxons as the English underclass, and you have the Normans as the aristocracy,
Hmm.
it creates a big split in the language. It's why we have two words for cow, right? So we have the word for cow, which is the Saxon word, which is the word we use for the cow in the field. But when it's on your plate, what do we call it?
Beef.
Tort. Because for the nobles, they ate beef, they called it a beef. But for the peasants who spoke Anglo-Saxon, they called it coo or cow, which is the Anglo-Saxon word.
Ah.
Same for pig and for pork, uh, and so there's a in English still to this day we often have two words for things. And we have the Saxon word and the Norman word. It's why we're both a Germanic language and a Latin language, and it's partly why our dictionaries are so thick.
It's also probably why English, I would imagine, is quite difficult to learn.
Yeah, it's very difficult to master. It's somewhat forgiving, actually. I've talked with people about this who've learned English, and it's actually surprisingly forgiving to learn, in that you can speak English poorly and still be understood, whereas other languages are much more fragile in the sense of that if you get just even the tiniest word wrong, the whole meaning of what you're saying changes and people don't understand you. Whereas like you have like Tarzan type characters whose English is pretty awful in terms of like grammar, but they're still very well understood. But mastering English, and particularly getting around the vocabulary and the spellings, is just crushing. And we all can relate, right? Because it's like the rules don't make sense. We don't follow our own rules half the time. I before E except after C is actually wrong more often than it's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
It's somebody finally did a statistical analysis. It's like, this is not a good rule.
Yeah, any law that no one ever follows is just not effective. It's not. But
Yeah.
listen, I know that I don't want your wife to resent me. So I want you to, I want you, I want to be in good with your family. So I want to let you know that this has been a total pleasure. I've really enjoyed this, and I would love you to take this opportunity to, if you want to address the chat, let them know where they can find you. I'm going to put your links in the video too. So, but if you want to let everybody know where they can find you, then sign off.
Yeah, there's the three shows that I mentioned at the top of the episode. So there's Novel Marketing, which is my marketing show where we will occasionally talk about culture and zeitgeist type topics.
Mhm.
So if you enjoy me talking about culture, the zeitgeist episodes, the culture and zeitgeist episodes are there. There's also, I have a playlist on YouTube called Crafted Culture, which are the more kind of culture narrative oriented episodes. Although some of that conversation happens over on the Christian Publishing Show, which is my second podcast. It's not on YouTube. It's a pure audio podcast right now. And then the third show is Author Update, which is currently part of Novel Marketing. So if you just go to the Novel Marketing YouTube, um, you'll find two of the three shows, and that's a weekly show where we discuss the news and how it applies to authors. And then I have a personal website, thomasumstattd.com, which if you can spell Umstattd, you can get there.
That'll narrow it down. Well, all right, Thomas. Thank you so much. Can I call you Tom? Is it okay, or is Thomas better?
So Tom is my dad and Tommy is my son, and so I'm stuck with Thomas for disambiguation purposes.
Because I have you on as Tom Umstattd, but I'm gonna change it to Thomas because I'm realizing that's not what you would prefer. But well, God bless you. This was wonderful. I had a wonderful time, and hopefully you can come on again sometime.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a good one.
You too.
Well, all right, everybody. I want to address the chat real quick. I probably missed quite a bit over the course of that entire conversation. English class was a lie. It was. It's true. Really smart guy. His I meant when I said his retention of information. Like he seems to be the kind of person who reads something and then it's like a steel trap. Yeah. When he came on the show, he was like, before we had spoken, he's like, I'm here because I want to tell you, he had a lot to say about the King Arthur legend, which was really cool. So, yeah, I want to pick his brain some more. I hope you guys had a good time. I hope everybody enjoyed this. Fascinating. Well, I also have to go because I have other things. I have some paid client work to do, and it's all NDA. But I'll be posting this on the Patreon and on the Discord. Maybe I'll do like an uncut version for there because I might cut out some parts of it just to keep it tighter. Because there's some rambly bits where I just talk and it just sounds like I'm falling down the stairs of words. All right, well, you guys have a good one. I'll see you later in the week. Bye, y'all.